Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here. My name is Seth Baum. I lead the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute, which is a nonprofit think tank working across a range of different risk areas. We cover climate change, disease outbreaks, nuclear weapons, and as of recently, near-Earth objects. And one of the main reasons why we work across all these different areas is to address the important intersections between them, which is the theme of the paper that I'm presenting today. But before going into that, I just want to say that from my perspective as someone who works across a number of different risk areas, I am genuinely impressed by the planetary defense community and the seriousness and sophistication with which you've been able to address the NEO threat, and also the interest and support you've generated, including from policy communities. I really like this line from the 1990 NASA authorization where the US Congress wrote, the chances of Earth being struck are extremely small, but the consequences are extremely large. And so it is only prudent to assess the nature of the threat and prepare to deal with it. And that just nails it. I wish everybody would look at catastrophic risks in this way. And so, thank you for making this happen and a whole lot more. And that brings us to the theme of the paper I'm presenting, which is the impacts of planetary defense programs on the risk of violent conflict. And there are three effects that I'll discuss. The first comes from the use of nuclear explosives for NEO deflection. The second from the possibility that an NEO collision could be misinterpreted as a violence attack and trigger a quote unquote counterattack. And then the third is the prospect of planetary defense serving as a model for global risk management. Now, I was speaking to the third point in my opening remarks. I'll just say one more quick word about that, which is to encourage the planetary defense community to document more of its history so that people who work on other risks can learn from that. I have personally benefited a great deal from a history written by Clark Chapman that covers the early period of planetary defense through around 1998. It'd be great to have something that goes from 1998 to the present. And also in my paper, I have a few specific suggestions for certain details that may be of particular interest to the broader risk community. So with that, we'll move on to nuclear deflection. Now, there are three aspects of this that I think are worth covering. One is the international treaty implications, which we've heard a lot about in previous talks. I'm not the legal scholar. I won't go into further detail on this. Just from my perspective as a risk analyst, the question that stands out to me is whether it is worth going to the considerable effort to revise the treaties or potentially even violate them. Essentially, do the benefits for NEO risk reduction outweigh these various costs? And it's not an easy question to answer. My intuition is that they probably do in the event that we actually detect a really large NEO that requires nuclear deflection, but otherwise it's maybe more ambiguous, but it's not a clear-cut question either way. Next, we have disarmament. Now, simply put, nuclear deflection is incompatible with the policy goal of a world without nuclear weapons. On the other hand, today we do not live in a world without nuclear weapons. We live in a world with 13,880 nuclear weapons, which is a lot fewer than the Cold War peak, but a lot more of the small handful you might need for nuclear deflection. And at the rate that disarmament is progressing, it could be several decades or even longer until the global nuclear arsenals get down to around a handful or so. And so my recommendation for the planetary defense community is to keep this in mind mainly as a factor in long-term planning over timescales of decades or so, and to potentially also reach out to disarmament communities to see if there are ways to coordinate these activities. That actually is something that I may be able to be of some assistance with. Actually, next week, I'll be in New York at the United Nations headquarters for the conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, where I would be curious to see what the people there think about this. And then finally, we have the nuclear taboo. Now, the taboo is the informal, but nonetheless very powerful social and psychological stigma that is placed against the use of nuclear weapons. And it may even be one of the main reasons why nuclear weapons have not been used in violence since World War II. And in order to maximize the strength of the taboo, it is applied not just to violent nuclear explosions, but to all of them, including the quote unquote peaceful nuclear explosions, such as shown here, the 1962 Sudan test, which was done to explore the use of nuclear explosives for mining. And EO deflection would fit in the same category, a peaceful nuclear explosion. But unfortunately, even this could potentially weaken the taboo. And furthermore, not just using it, but even the discussion of potentially using it, like what we have here at this conference, could weaken the taboo at least a little bit. And it's not clear that there's any good way around this. This raises the question then of whether it is, again, outweighed by the benefits for NEO reduction. It's an important question, not an easy one to answer. All right, finally, we have inadvertent conflict. Now, my group has actually done a fairly detailed study of the history of nuclear weapons, in particular false alarm events that have over the years gone at least partway towards triggering an inadvertent nuclear war. For example, in 1995, the United States and Norway launched a Black Brant scientific weather rocket. Russian radar picked it up, and they woke up President Yeltsin in the middle of the night. Yeltsin thought it through, said, no, this can't be an attack. Let's not launch anything in response to this. And because of that, we are all still alive. Now, what's interesting about this history of all of these nuclear weapons false alarms is that none of them involve any actual damage to the quote unquote victim country. They're all things of this sort or technical glitches and so on. In contrast, an NEO collision could indeed involve damage, and in fact, the damage that looks quite a lot like the damage that you get from military attacks, including nuclear attacks. And so from my perspective, having studied this history of nuclear weapons, the prospect that an NEO collision could trigger a counterattack, to me seems like something worth taking very seriously. And there are some hints of this in the history of NEOs, most notably the Chelyabinsk event, which happened to take place right down the road from an important Russian nuclear facility. Now, I am not aware of any indications that the Russians or anyone else had misinterpreted Chelyabinsk as a military attack or prepared any sort of military response to it. Nonetheless, the event does speak to the possibility of it. In my paper, I present a very simple risk model for calculating the frequency or the probability of this type of conflict scenario. And what I can say is that, well, it's probably hard to quantify, especially for the probability that a state would decide to retaliate in response to that, but nonetheless seems worth quantifying. And I may be doing further work on this in the future, since my expertise is actually mainly on the nuclear weapons side. Anyone here with expertise on the NEO side who's interested in collaborating, I'd love to hear from you. And so this is one area where the probability may well turn out to be extremely small, but the consequences would be extremely large. And so I think it is only prudent that we assess the nature of the threat and what we can do to deal with it. And as far as what we can do, there are at least two things. First is to raise awareness about NEO collisions so that countries don't mistake them for violent attacks. And second, to the extent that we can detect incoming collisions and then relay that information to the militaries around the world, especially the ones with nuclear weapons, so that they know an explosion is coming and it's not an attack. Both of those things, I think, could help reduce this risk. Here is a summary of all of the recommendations I might suggest, and I'd look forward to any questions you might have on this. Thank you.
Yes, I wrote a paper with Gene Shoemaker back in the 80s, I think, raising the point that a NEO event could be mistaken for a nuclear attack. But since that time, I've come to think that more important and less controllable is not really an honest mistake for a nuclear attack, but using it as an excuse to say that that might have been a nuclear attack, so we're going to retaliate. In other words, a malicious entity could just pretend they made a mistake to launch an attack that they actually wanted to make.
So a basic idea in the study of inadvertent nuclear war is that it is a lot more likely when the geopolitical tensions are high. That if the tensions are high, they're more likely to interpret some event, whether it's an NEO collision or a technical glitch or what have you, as being an actual attack. And they might likewise be more inclined to launch their weapons in response. And fortunately, in 1995, tensions were fairly calm between the United States and Russia, and that contributed probably to the successful resolution of that incident. So I think there is something to be said for that.
I was wondering if you've looked into the possibility of kind of domestic conflicts or for groups who might not agree with the use of using a nuclear device, or for if you have a group that doesn't think the, say, same page is doing enough to prevent a particular NEO strike. Just basically large-scale protests to the current decision.
So the answer is actually no. That is not something that I have looked at, but it's a very interesting idea. Thank you.
Yeah, and kind of going along the same lines, but putting on my devious rant hat, what if there's conflict, like conventional conflict that's triggered, or like an attack that's triggered by one country on the NEO deflection, whatever mission of another country, whether the one country thinks it's in its advantage to have the other country, get hit by the NEO. And therefore they try to sabotage the mission, whether, by legal means or by, physical means, by, blowing up the launch site or creating a diversionary war, anything like that.
So this is the idea of using the NEO itself as a weapon?
Well, if like country A gets hit and country B would prefer country A to get hit by the NEO, then country B might not want country A to do anything about getting hit.
Yeah, that is devious.
Thank you.
So I would like to think that something like that would not happen. So there is the idea that's out there that you could use an NEO as a weapon. That's, I think, Carl Sagan and colleagues have considered this. And my general sense is there just seem like easier ways to attack other countries than by redirecting NEOs toward them. That said, what you're talking about is sabotaging a mission so that the country gets hit. That's probably a lot easier and maybe a bit more plausible, especially if there are subtle ways to sabotage it, especially if you don't get caught. Then, yeah, I mean, maybe we probably shouldn't say all of this out loud, but that's an interesting possibility. Thank you.
So any other questions?
So Chris Johnson again from Secure World. The one antidote to suspicion and escalation is transparency and confidence building measures. And I think that's one of the best solutions to this, these bad outcomes that we can have of states undertaking actions for peaceful purposes, for saving the world, and it being interpreted in the wrong fashion. So there must be more study and more insight done into how nations can not only organize on the national level of interagency review and coordination, but sharing those plans not just with the allies, but with those who may interpret things in a cynical or suspicious fashion.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. And this is another reason, not the only reason, but a reason why global cooperation on NEOs can be very important, including with countries that might otherwise be adversaries towards each other. In a certain sense, we are kind of all in this one together.
So any other question? So thank you very much to